The gun was already raised. The man on his knees was praying in Italian. Blood from an earlier beating pooled beneath him. This was supposed to be routine. A mafia execution. Quick, clean, final. Then the door opened, and everything changed. Bumpy Johnson walked into that warehouse like he owned it. No weapon visible. No backup. Just confidence that could freeze a room. The gunman hesitated. The boss looked up, confused. Because this wasn't Bumpy's world. This was Italian territory. Mafia business. And black gangsters didn't interrupt La Cosa Nostra ceremonies. Except Bumpy just had. What happened in the next 3 minutes would shatter a crime family that had ruled New York for 2 decades. It would rewrite the power structure of the entire city. And it would prove something the mob had refused to believe. That Bumpy Johnson wasn't just Harlem's king. He was a force that even the Italians couldn't ignore. New York in 1952 operated on invisible borders. The 5 families controlled most of Manhattan. Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno. They ran construction, unions, garbage collection, the docks. They decided who lived and who died in neighborhoods they'd never actually lived in. But Harlem was different. Harlem had Bumpy Johnson. By 1952, Bumpy had spent nearly 3 decades building his empire. He'd survived Sing Sing, survived Dutch Schultz's attempts to muscle into his territory, survived the transition from prohibition to the numbers racket. He'd done it by being smarter, more strategic, and more ruthless than anyone expected a black gangster to be. The relationship between Bumpy and the Italian families was complicated. They respected his control of Harlem, recognized he kept the peace better than they ever could. But respect had limits, and those limits were defined by race. The Italians saw themselves as the real mafia, the legitimate underworld. Everyone else, including Bumpy, was just playing in their shadow. The Genovese family controlled most of the operations adjacent to Harlem. Their territory ran from Midtown through parts of the Bronx. And their current boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante's predecessor, was a man named Anthony Strollo, better known as Tony Bender. Tony Bender was old school, ruthless, traditional. He believed in the Italian way of doing things. Blood oaths, omerta, and the absolute certainty that Italians sat at the top of the criminal hierarchy. His crew included men who'd been making money off Harlem for years. Protection rackets targeting black businesses. Loan sharking, skimming profits from nightclubs. They operated on the edges of Bumpy's territory. Carefully, never pushing too far, but always present. One of Bender's soldiers was a man named Paolo Moretti. Mid-level enforcer. Good earner. Loyal for 15 years. But Paolo had made a mistake. A big one. He'd been skimming from the family's take. Not much. Just enough to buy a house in Queens. Enough to send his kids to better schools. Enough to get caught. In the Mafia, stealing from the family was unforgivable. Worse than being a rat. Because it showed you valued yourself over the organization. The penalty was always the same. Death. But not just death. A message. Paolo's execution was scheduled for a Tuesday night in March. A warehouse in the Bronx. Away from prying eyes. Away from police patrols. A place where screams wouldn't carry. Where blood could be hosed away. Where one man's mistake would remind everyone else why loyalty mattered. The family gathered. 15 men. Some to witness. Some to participate. All to remember. Tony Bender would oversee it personally. Because Paolo had been his soldier. His responsibility. His failure. And this was how you corrected failures. With violence. With finality. With certainty. They had no idea Bumpy Johnson was coming. Had no idea Paolo's wife had begged for help from the one man in New York who might be able to stop this. Had no idea that the invisible borders they'd drawn were about to be redrawn. Completely. The call came to Bumpy's brownstone at 4 in the afternoon. A woman's voice. Shaking. Desperate. Maria Moretti. She'd heard about her husband through whispers. Through coded conversations she wasn't supposed to understand. Paolo was going to die. Tonight. And she had nowhere else to turn. The police wouldn't help. Couldn't help. This was mafia business. Beyond their jurisdiction. Beyond their willingness to interfere. She tried calling lawyers. Family friends. Anyone with connections. They all said the same thing. Once the family decided, it was done. There was no appeal. No negotiation. Just acceptance. But Maria had heard stories about Bumpy Johnson. About how he protected people in Harlem. About how he operated by different rules. About how he'd stood up to powerful men before and survived. She didn't know if he'd help. Didn't know if he could, but she was out of options. Bumpy listened without interrupting. His face showed nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just calculation. When she finished, he asked one question. Why should I care about your husband? Maria's voice cracked. Because he's a good man. Because he has 3 children. Because this isn't justice, it's murder. Bumpy was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised even himself. Where and when? Maria gave him the address. The warehouse in the Bronx. 9 o'clock. 2 hours away. Bumpy hung up and sat in his office, thinking. This wasn't his fight. Paolo Moretti wasn't his soldier. Wasn't even his friend. Saving him would accomplish nothing. Would potentially create massive problems. Would cross a line that had never been crossed before. But there was something else. Something Bumpy had been feeling for months. The Italians were getting comfortable. Too comfortable. They'd been pushing into Harlem's edges. Taking liberties. Assuming Bumpy would tolerate it because he always had. This wasn't about Paolo. It was about sending a different kind of message. About reminding the families that Bumpy Johnson's respect had limits. That their assumptions about hierarchy were negotiable. That the invisible borders could shift. At 7 o'clock, Bumpy called a meeting. Just 3 of his most trusted men. Jericho, Willie, and a new lieutenant named Nat Pettigrew. He laid out the situation. Told them what he was planning. The room went silent. Willie spoke first. Boss, this is insane. You walk into a Mafia execution, you might not walk out. Bumpy nodded. Might not. But I'm not asking you to come. This one's on me. Jericho leaned forward. Then why tell us? Because if I don't come back, you need to know what happened. And you need to finish what I started. He explained the larger strategy. This wasn't just about saving Paolo. It was about leverage. About information. About creating a situation where the Genovese family owed him something they could never repay. At 8:30, Bumpy left the brownstone. Alone. Dressed in an expensive suit. Hat pulled low. He drove himself. Through Harlem. Through the east side. Into the Bronx. The warehouse was in an industrial area. Abandoned buildings. Empty lots. No witnesses. Perfect for what the mob had planned. Bumpy parked 2 blocks away. Walked the rest. His footsteps echoed on broken pavement. He wasn't armed. Carrying a gun would be seen as aggression. Would give them justification to shoot first and ask questions later. Instead, he carried something more dangerous. Information. 3 weeks earlier, one of Bumpy's informants had brought him documents. Financial records from a Genovese operation. Proof that Tony Bender had been skimming millions from the family's take. Not hundreds like Paolo. Millions. Diverting money through shell companies. Buying property under fake names. Building a nest egg for retirement. It was enough to get Bender killed 10 times over. But Bumpy had kept it quiet. Waiting. Because information was only valuable when you needed it. And tonight, he needed it. He approached the warehouse. 2 guards outside. They saw him coming. Hands moved toward guns. Bumpy kept walking. Steady. Unthreatened. I'm here to see Tony Bender, he said. He's expecting me. That was a lie, but delivered with such confidence that the guards hesitated. One of them went inside. Came back 30 seconds later. Face confused. He says he doesn't know any Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy smiled. Tell him I know about the accounts in the Cayman Islands. Tell him I know about the property in Miami. Tell him I have documents. And tell him if he wants them to stay buried, he'll let me in. The guard's expression changed. Fear replacing confusion. He went back inside. This time, he was gone for 2 minutes. When he returned, he stepped aside. The door opened, and Bumpy Johnson walked into a Mafia execution like he'd been invited. The warehouse was dimly lit. 15 men stood in a semicircle. In the center, Paolo Moretti knelt on concrete. Hands tied behind his back. Face already beaten. Blood dripping from his mouth. A man Bumpy recognized as Tony Bender stood closest. Gun in hand. Ready to deliver the final shot. The room froze when Bumpy entered. Every eye turned toward him. Confusion. Anger. Disbelief. Because this didn't happen. Outsiders didn't interrupt family business. Especially not black gangsters. Tony Bender's face went through several emotions at once. Shock. Rage. Then something else when he processed what the guard must have told him. Fear. This is a private matter, Bender said. His voice trying for authority. Missing. Bumpy stopped 10 feet away. Not anymore. The silence stretched. 15 armed men. 1 unarmed intruder. The math should have been simple. But nothing about this situation was simple. Tony Bender's hand tightened on his gun. But he didn't raise it. Didn't point it at Bumpy. Because they both knew what was really happening here. This wasn't about Paolo. This was about exposure. About secrets. About the documents Bumpy had mentioned. Documents that could end Bender's life. You got some nerve, Bender finally said. Walking in here. Into family business. Bumpy's expression didn't change. I got information. Thought you might want to discuss it before you make any permanent decisions. One of the soldiers, a thick-necked enforcer named Carmine, stepped forward. Boss, you want me to handle this? Bender raised his hand. Stopped him. Nobody touches him. Not yet. He looked at Bumpy. Really looked at him. Trying to calculate. Trying to figure out if this was a bluff. If the documents were real. If Bumpy actually had the evidence he claimed. Let's talk, Bender said. In private. They moved to a small office in the back of the warehouse. Bender closed the door. The pretense dropped immediately. What do you want? Bender asked. No more posturing. Just business. Bumpy gestured toward the main room. Him. Paolo. I want him to walk out of here alive. Bender laughed. Sharp. Bitter. That's not how this works. He stole from the family. There's a price for that. Always. And you stole millions, Bumpy said quietly. What's the price for that? The color drained from Bender's face. You don't know what you're talking about. Bumpy reached into his jacket. Bender's hand moved to his gun. But Bumpy just pulled out a folded piece of paper. Handed it over. Bender unfolded it. Read. His hand started shaking. It was a bank statement. Cayman Islands account. Under a name that wasn't his, but might as well have been. $3 million. Money that should have gone to the family. Money that had been diverted. Hidden. Stolen. I have 40 more pages like this, Bumpy said. Transaction records. Property deeds. All of it linking back to you. All of it proving you've been skimming for 5 years. Bender crumpled the paper. Rage and fear fighting for control of his expression. If you go public with this, you're a dead man. The family will hunt you. Kill everyone you've ever known. Bumpy sat down. Made himself comfortable. Like they were discussing the weather. Maybe. But you'll be dead first. And your family. Your real family. Maria and the kids. Because that's what the commission does to thieves, right? They don't just kill the man. They erase the bloodline. It was a bluff. The commission didn't actually operate that way. But Bender didn't know if Bumpy knew that. And the fear was enough. So here's what's going to happen, Bumpy continued. Paolo walks out of here tonight. Alive. Unharmed. You tell your men it was a mistake. That you showed mercy. That the family is forgiving. Bender shook his head. They'll never accept that. I'll look weak. Then be creative. Say you're testing his loyalty. Say you're using him for something else. I don't care what story you tell. But he lives. Bender was silent. Calculating. Trying to find another way. There wasn't one. And the documents? He asked. They disappear, Bumpy said. I keep copies. Insurance. But as long as you and I understand each other, nobody else ever sees them. Understand each other how? Bumpy leaned forward. Your people stop pushing into Harlem. Stop the protection rackets on 125th Street. Stop skimming from the clubs. You respect my territory. Really respect it. Not just lip service. Bender's jaw clenched. The other families won't like this. The other families don't need to know. This is between you and me. A private arrangement. You get to keep stealing from them. I get to keep Harlem clean. Everybody wins. It was brilliant, cruel, and completely effective. Bender had no choice. Exposure meant death. Cooperation meant survival. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to get those documents back later. Kill Bumpy. Destroy the evidence. Reclaim his position. But that was future planning. Right now, he needed to survive tonight. Fine, Bender said. He lives. But you owe me for this. Bumpy stood, adjusted his hat. I don't owe you anything. You owe me. And if you forget that, I'll remind you. They walked back into the main room. The soldiers were restless. Confused. Paolo was still on his knees. Still bleeding. Still waiting to die? Bender cleared his throat. Everyone turned. Change of plans, he announced. His voice was steady, authoritative, giving no hint of what had just transpired. Paolo's not dying tonight. We're using him for something else. Something more valuable than revenge. The soldiers exchanged glances. Confused but not questioning. You didn't question the boss. Not in front of outsiders. Bender walked over to Paolo, grabbed his collar, pulled him to his feet. You're getting a second chance. Don't make me regret it. Paolo's eyes were wide, disbelieving. He'd been prepared to die, had made peace with it. And now, suddenly, inexplicably, he was being spared. Bumpy watched without expression. This was the moment. The fulcrum. Everything could still collapse. One soldier could object, could question, could force Bender's hand. But nobody spoke, because Tony Bender had spoken, and his word was law. Bumpy turned toward the door, started walking. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed. He'd walked into a Mafia execution, stopped it with information and leverage, and walked out alive. But as he stepped into the night air, he knew something critical. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. The drive back to Harlem felt longer than it should have. Bumpy's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was racing. He'd just done something unprecedented. Not just saving Paolo, but humiliating a Mafia boss in front of his own men, creating a crack in the foundation of organized crime's racial hierarchy. Tony Bender would smile, would pretend everything was fine, would tell his soldiers that sparing Paolo was strategic. But inside, he'd be planning, calculating, looking for the moment to strike back. Bumpy knew this, expected it, was already 3 moves ahead. When he arrived at the brownstone, his men were waiting. Jericho stood immediately. "You're alive." It wasn't a question, just relief. "Paolo?" Willie asked. "Walking free. Should be home with his family by midnight." The room erupted in questions. "How did you do it? What did you say? What did Bender agree to?" Bumpy raised his hand. Silence fell. "What happened in that warehouse stays between me and Bender. What matters is what happens next." He walked to the map on his wall. New York divided into territories, color-coded, marked with pins representing operations, alliances, conflicts. "The Genovese family just learned something tonight," Bumpy said. "They learned I have leverage. They learned I can reach them. And they learned that the rules they thought were fixed are actually negotiable." Nat Pettigrew, the youngest of the group, spoke up. "They'll come for you. For revenge. For saving face." Bumpy nodded. "They will. But not immediately. First, they'll investigate. Try to figure out how I got those documents. Try to verify if they're real. Try to find copies. That gives us time." "Time for what?" Jericho asked. "To prepare for war. Because that's what's coming. Not tomorrow. Maybe not next month. But eventually. And when it comes, we need to be ready." Over the next 3 weeks, Bumpy moved with precision. He doubled security at all his operations, put extra men on the streets, made sure every numbers runner, every club owner, every person in his network understood the situation. The Italians might retaliate. Be vigilant. Report anything unusual. He also reached out to contacts in other families. The Lucchese crew, the Colombo organization. Not to form alliances, just to plant seeds. To let them know, casually, that Tony Bender might not be as loyal as he appeared. That there might be financial irregularities worth investigating. It was psychological warfare, making Bender defend on multiple fronts, making him paranoid, making him wonder who else knew about his theft. Meanwhile, Paolo Murray disappeared. Bumpy had arranged it. A house in Pennsylvania. New identities for the family. Protection until things cooled down. Maria called once to thank him. Her voice was thick with emotion, with gratitude she couldn't fully express. Bumpy told her to forget his name, to never mention what happened, to live quietly and never come back to New York. She promised, kept her word. But the story spread anyway. Not through Maria, through the soldiers who'd been in that warehouse, through whispers in social clubs, through the underground network that carried news faster than newspapers. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a Mafia execution and stopped it. A black gangster had humiliated Tony Bender, had forced him to show mercy, had exposed cracks in the Italian mob's authority. The reactions were mixed. Some saw it as Bumpy overstepping, getting too bold, inviting destruction. Others saw it as brilliant, a power play that shifted the entire dynamic of New York's underworld. In Harlem, the response was unanimous. Pride. Bumpy had stood up to the Italians, had proven that respect flowed both ways, had shown that being black didn't mean being subordinate. The younger generation especially took notice. Men who'd grown up watching the mob operate with impunity, who'd assumed Italian supremacy was natural law. Now they saw differently, saw possibility. But with visibility came danger. The FBI had informants everywhere, and this story was too big to ignore. Special Agent Thomas Garrett, who'd been tracking organized crime in New York for a decade, started building a file. Not on the execution, on Bumpy's intervention, on the leverage he'd used, on the documents he'd mentioned. Garrett was smart, patient. He didn't move immediately, didn't bring Bumpy in for questioning. Just watched, listened, waited for pieces to connect. And in the Genovese family, Tony Bender was doing exactly what Bumpy predicted. Investigating. He had his accountant review the books, had his lawyer examine the Cayman accounts, had his most trusted soldiers dig into how Bumpy could have possibly obtained that information. What he discovered terrified him. The documents were real. The accounts existed. Bumpy hadn't been bluffing, which meant someone inside the organization had leaked, had betrayed the family, had given ammunition to an outsider. Bender started looking at his own men with suspicion, questioning loyalties, creating paranoia that festered like infection. He never found the leak, because it hadn't come from inside. It had come from a bank employee Bumpy had paid off years earlier. Someone who fed him information on anyone opening offshore accounts. Someone the Italians never suspected. By late April, the tension was unbearable. Bumpy's men reported unusual activity. Italian soldiers watching their operations. Cars following key players. Conversations that stopped when certain names were mentioned. The war was coming. Not declared openly. Not with guns blazing in the streets. But with strategy. With moves and countermoves. With each side probing for weakness. Bumpy called another meeting. This time, 15 men. His entire inner circle. They're going to make a move, he said. Soon. And when they do, it won't be against me directly. It'll be against someone I care about. Someone I'd sacrifice my position to protect. The room went quiet. Because everyone knew what that meant. Family. Close associates. The foundations of Bumpy's empire. So we move first, Bumpy continued. Not with violence. With information. With pressure. We dismantle Tony Bender before he can strike. Jericho frowned. How? Bumpy smiled. It wasn't pleasant. We give the other families what they want. Proof that Bender's been stealing. Proof that he's weak. Proof that he's a liability. It was ruthless, calculated, and completely necessary. Because in the world Bumpy inhabited, mercy was a currency you spent once. After that, you dealt in power. The meeting happened in a restaurant in Little Italy. Rouse. A place where mob business had been conducted for decades. Private. Secure. Neutral ground. But tonight, neutrality was an illusion. Bumpy had orchestrated everything. The attendees. The timing. The information that would be revealed. He wasn't invited. Wasn't welcome. But his influence was everywhere. At the table sat 5 men. Representatives from each of the 5 families. Vincent Mangano from the Gambino crew. Tommy Lucchese himself. Joe Colombo's underboss. A Banano captain. And representing the Genovese family, Tony Bender. They'd been summoned by an anonymous message. A meeting to discuss irregularities in family operations. Inter-family audits weren't common, but they happened when someone raised concerns. When money didn't flow correctly. When questions needed answers. Bender had no choice but to attend. Refusing would signal guilt. Would invite more scrutiny. So he came. Confident. Prepared to deflect. Prepared to lie. He had no idea what was waiting. The meeting started cordially. Drinks ordered. Small talk about business. About territories. About the usual concerns that occupied men who ran criminal empires. Then Tommy Lucchese placed an envelope on the table. We received some interesting information, he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were cold. About financial discrepancies. Thought it was worth discussing. As a family. As professionals. Bender's throat tightened, but his face showed nothing. What kind of discrepancies? Lucchese opened the envelope. Pulled out documents. Bank statements. Transaction records. Property deeds. All the evidence Bumpy had collected. All the proof of Bender's theft. Cayman accounts, Lucchese said. Registered under shell companies. But traceable back to you, Tony. $3 million. Maybe more. Money that should have been distributed to the families. Money that went into your personal accounts instead. The room temperature dropped. The other representatives leaned forward, examining the documents, passing them around, their expressions hardening with each page. Bender tried to speak, tried to explain. This is fabricated. Someone's trying to set me up. We verified it, Mangano interrupted. Had our people check with the banks. Check the properties. It's all real, Tony. All yours. Bender's mind raced. How did they get this? How did they verify it so quickly? Then it hit him. Bumpy. This was Bumpy's move. The revenge he'd been waiting for. The leverage had been shared. Multiplied. Turned from a private threat into a public execution. Who brought you this information? Bender demanded. Lucchese smiled. Does it matter? The question isn't who told us. The question is whether it's true. And it is. Bender stood, chair scraping against the floor. I've been loyal to this family for 30 years. I've earned. I've produced. I've kept my mouth shut when others talked. And you're going to believe some anonymous. Sit down, Mangano said. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Authority. The kind of command you didn't ignore. Bender sat. The other families conferred quietly. Whispered conversations. Glances at Bender. At the documents. At each other. This was a trial. And the verdict was already decided. Here's what's going to happen, Lucchese finally said. You're going to return every dollar you stole. Liquidate the properties. Close the accounts. Everything goes back to the families. Distributed fairly. Bender's jaw clenched. And if I don't, then this becomes a commission matter. And you know how those end. Death. That's how they ended. Excommunication followed by execution. Bender understood. But returning the money meant admitting guilt. Meant losing his position. Meant humiliation. I need time, he said, to gather the funds. You have 2 weeks, Mangano interrupted. After that, we move forward without you. The meeting ended. The representatives left. Bender sat alone at the table, staring at the documents, at the evidence of his betrayal, now shared with everyone who mattered. Outside, 3 blocks away, Bumpy sat in his car, waiting, watching. He'd stationed men around the restaurant, not to interfere, just to observe, to confirm what he already knew. At 9:30, his radio crackled. Jericho's voice. They're leaving. Bender's still inside. Looks shaken. Bumpy smiled. Good. Let him sit with it. This was the climax. Not violence. Not gunfire. But the systematic destruction of a man's power through his own greed. Through evidence he couldn't deny. Through consequences he couldn't escape. Bumpy had saved Paolo. Had stopped an execution. And in doing so, had discovered leverage powerful enough to topple a Mafia captain. But he hadn't used it immediately. Hadn't threatened. Hadn't extorted beyond the initial agreement. Instead, he'd waited. Watched Bender violate their arrangement. Watched him continue pushing into Harlem. Continue disrespecting the boundaries. And then, with surgical precision, Bumpy had activated the nuclear option. Not to blackmail Bender privately, but to expose him to the very organization he'd stolen from. To turn the families against their own. To create a situation where Bumpy didn't have to destroy Bender. The Italians would do it themselves. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely effective. Because the one thing the mob couldn't tolerate was theft from within. They'd built their entire code around loyalty. Around omerta. Around the idea that the family came first. Bender had violated that. And Bumpy had simply revealed it. The drive back to Harlem felt different than the drive from the warehouse weeks earlier. Then, Bumpy had been uncertain, playing a dangerous game with unclear outcomes. Now he was certain. The game was over. And he'd won. Not by matching the Italians' violence. Not by declaring war. But by understanding their rules better than they did. By using their own structure against them. By being smarter. More patient. More strategic. When he arrived at the brownstone, his men were celebrating. Word had already spread. Tony Bender was finished. The Genovese family was in chaos. And Bumpy Johnson had orchestrated all of it without firing a single shot. But Bumpy didn't celebrate. He sat in his office, thinking about what came next. Because destroying one captain didn't end the game. It just changed the board. Tony Bender had 2 weeks to return $3 million. Money he'd spent, invested, hidden in assets that couldn't be liquidated quickly. Property in Miami. A restaurant in Atlantic City. Investments in legitimate businesses that took time to unwind. He was trapped, and he knew it. The first person he called was his lawyer, a man who specialized in making problems disappear. The lawyer listened, reviewed the documents, and delivered the worst possible news. There's no legal defense here, Tony. The evidence is airtight. If you try to fight this, you'll lose. And then you'll be facing federal charges on top of commission justice. Bender slammed the phone down, paced his office like a caged animal. Every option led to ruin. Return the money, lose everything, face humiliation. Keep the money, face execution. There was no winning scenario, unless he could find the source. Find Bumpy. Kill him. Destroy any remaining evidence. Reclaim control through violence. It was desperate, reckless, but it was all he had left. He called a meeting with his most loyal soldiers. 6 men who'd been with him for years. Men who'd kill without question if ordered. We have a problem, Bender said. Bumpy Johnson has been interfering with family business. He stopped Paolo's execution. He leaked information to the other families. He's trying to destroy us from the inside. The soldiers exchanged glances. They'd heard rumors. Whispers about what happened in that warehouse. About the documents. About Bender's stolen millions. But hearing it directly was different. Carmine, the enforcer who'd wanted to shoot Bumpy that night, spoke first. So we clip him. Send a message. Show everyone what happens when you fuck with the Genovese family. Bender nodded. Exactly. But it has to be clean. No witnesses. No connection back to us. The other families are watching. If they think we're starting a war with Harlem, they'll side against us. Another soldier, a methodical killer named Paulie, leaned forward. Soon, Bender said. Before the 2 weeks are up. Before I have to liquidate everything. We take him out, the evidence disappears with him, and we claim someone else was setting me up. Shifting blame to a dead man. It was a plan born of desperation. Full of holes. But Bender couldn't see them through his rage and fear. The hit was scheduled for 3 days later. Friday night. Bumpy's routine was studied. He usually left the brownstone around 10, headed to one of his clubs. Predictable route. Predictable timing. The soldiers would wait on 132nd Street. 2 cars. For shooters. They'd box him in. Rapid fire. No survivors. Then disappear into the Bronx before police could respond. But Bumpy had informants everywhere, including inside the Genovese family. A low-level associate who'd been feeding information to Harlem for years. On Thursday afternoon, word reached Bumpy. Bender had ordered a hit. Friday night. 132nd Street. Ambush. Bumpy gathered his inner circle. Laid out what he knew. Jericho's reaction was immediate. We hit them first. Tonight. Take out Bender and his crew before they can move. Bumpy shook his head. That's what they expect. What they want. An excuse to claim self-defense. To turn the other families against us. Willie frowned. So what do? Let them come. We let them come, Bumpy confirmed. But not for me. For someone else. He explained the plan. It was risky. Required perfect timing. Required trust in people who'd never worked together before. But it was the only way to end this without starting a full-scale war. Friday night arrived. Bumpy left the brownstone at his usual time, wearing his usual suit, driving his usual car. But he wasn't alone. In the back seat, hidden, was Nat Pettigrew. Armed. Ready. Following 3 blocks behind were 2 more cars. Bumpy's men. Prepared for violence, but hoping to avoid it. On 132nd Street, Bender's shooters waited. 2 Cadillacs. Engines running. Windows down slightly. Tommy guns ready. They saw Bumpy's car approaching. Right on schedule. Right where they expected. Carmine gave the signal. The Cadillacs pulled out. Boxing Bumpy in. Doors opening. Guns raising. Then everything changed. From side streets, police cars appeared. Sirens wailing. Lights flashing. 6 vehicles converging on the ambush point. The shooters froze. Confused. Panicked. Some tried to run. Others tried to hide their weapons. But it was too late. The cops were already out. Guns drawn. Shouting orders. Drop your weapons. Hands up. Now. It was a setup. But not by Bumpy alone. By someone with far more authority. Someone who'd been watching this situation develop with great interest. FBI Special Agent Thomas Garrett. He'd been building his case. Watching the tension between Bumpy and the Genovese family. Waiting for the moment when violence became inevitable. When Bumpy's informant had tipped him off about the hit, Bumpy had made a choice. A calculated risk. He'd shared the information with Garrett. Given him the location. The timing. The participants. In exchange for one thing. Immunity. Not for past crimes. But for this specific incident. For stopping a Mafia execution. For exposing Tony Bender. For preventing a gang war. Garrett had agreed. Because bringing down a Genovese captain was worth more than arresting a Harlem numbers runner. Because the FBI wanted the Italian mob more than they wanted Bumpy. Because sometimes, the enemy of your enemy was useful. The arrests happened quickly. Carmine. Paulie. For other soldiers. All caught with weapons. All clearly planning an assassination. All connected to Tony Bender, who would now face additional charges. Conspiracy to commit murder. Attempted murder. Federal crimes that carried decades of prison time. Bumpy drove past the chaos. Didn't stop. Didn't look back. Just kept moving toward Harlem. Toward home. Toward safety. In the back seat, Nat Pettigrew let out a breath he'd been holding. That was too close. Bumpy nodded. That was necessary. Bender had to make his move. Had to prove he was willing to kill. Now the families know. The FBI knows. And Bender's finished. It was the final piece. The checkmate. Bumpy had saved Paolo, exposed Bender's theft, and now prevented his own assassination while getting federal law enforcement to eliminate the threat. 3 moves. 3 victories. Each one building on the last. Each one demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that transcended simple gang warfare. This was chess played at the highest level, with lives as pieces, with entire criminal organizations as the board. And Bumpy Johnson had just declared victory. Tony Bender never made it to trial. 3 weeks after the arrests, his body was found in the Hudson River. Hands tied. Single bullet to the back of the head. Classic mob execution. The commission had delivered its verdict. Not in a courtroom. In the water. Bender had become a liability. The stolen millions. The failed hit. The FBI attention. All of it made him more valuable dead than alive. The Genovese family moved quickly to distance themselves. Claimed Bender had been operating independently. That they discovered his theft and handled it internally. That justice had been served according to their rules. The other families accepted this. Because it was convenient. Because it closed the matter. Because Tony Bender's death meant they could all move forward without further complications. The FBI investigation stalled. Without Bender to testify, without the shooters willing to talk, the conspiracy case fell apart. Carmine and the others were charged with weapons violations. Minor sentences. 2 years maximum. They'd be out before anyone forgot their names. Special Agent Garrett wasn't happy. But he understood. He'd gotten what he could. Removed a Mafia captain. Disrupted Genovese operations. Built files on dozens of connected men. It wasn't a complete victory. But in the war against organized crime, partial victories were all anyone ever got. For Bumpy, the aftermath was quieter. More subtle. The other families reached out. Not with threats. With respect. The Lucchese crew sent a representative. A sit-down in a Harlem restaurant. Neutral ground. The message was simple. You handled the Bender situation well. Professional. Smart. The families appreciate that you didn't escalate. Didn't turn this into a war. Bumpy nodded. Accepted the compliment. Said nothing about his role in exposing Bender. Said nothing about the FBI coordination. Just listened. Harlem is yours, the representative continued. Officially recognized. No more incursions. No more protection rackets. No more disrespect. You've earned that. It was everything Bumpy had wanted. Not through violence. Not through intimidation. But through strategy. Through patience. Through understanding the system better than those who'd created it. The Gambino family sent a similar message. So did the Colombos. Even the Bananos, who rarely involved themselves in Manhattan politics, acknowledged Bumpy's position. Within 6 weeks, the invisible borders had been redrawn. Harlem wasn't just tolerated territory. It was sovereign, protected, untouchable. But recognition came with expectations. The families wanted stability. Wanted assurance that Bumpy wouldn't use his newfound leverage to expand. Wouldn't challenge them in their own territories. Bumpy agreed. Because he'd never wanted empire. Just protection. Just the ability to operate without interference. Just respect. In Harlem itself, the reaction was celebration. Not public. Not obvious. But in barbershops and churches and street corners, people talked. About how Bumpy had stood up to the Italians. How he'd saved a man's life. How he'd outmaneuvered a Mafia captain. How he'd proven that black gangsters deserved the same respect as white ones. The younger generation especially took notice. Men like Frank Lucas, who was just starting out. Nicky Barnes, still learning the game. They saw what Bumpy had accomplished. Saw the blueprint. Saw that intelligence mattered more than violence. That strategy trumped strength. That respect was earned through calculated moves, not reckless aggression. Bumpy's empire grew. Not territorially, but in influence. In connections. In the understanding that he was no longer just a local power. He was a force that even the 5 families acknowledged. The numbers racket expanded. The clubs thrived. Money flowed more freely because Italian interference had stopped. Because the protection rackets had ended. Because Harlem businesses could operate without paying tribute to outsiders. Paolo Mariti never returned to New York. But he sent a letter. A simple thank you. An acknowledgement that Bumpy had saved not just his life, but his family's future. Bumpy burned the letter after reading it. No evidence. No connections. No paper trail. That's how you survived. By leaving nothing behind that could be used against you. By keeping secrets even from yourself sometimes. The Rhythm Room hosted a private celebration. Just Bumpy's inner circle. 15 men who'd stood with him through the entire ordeal. Who'd trusted his strategy even when it seemed insane. Who'd been ready to fight, but grateful they hadn't needed to. Jericho raised a glass. To the boss. Who proved you don't need to be Italian to outthink the Italians. Everyone drank. Laughed. Relaxed for the first time in months. But Bumpy remained thoughtful. Quiet. Because he understood something his men didn't. This victory had made him more visible. More important. More valuable to law enforcement as a potential informant or target. The FBI would be watching closer now. Building files. Looking for leverage. And the families, despite their respect, would always see him as an outsider. Someone to tolerate but never fully trust. Someone who could be useful or dangerous depending on circumstances. The game hadn't ended. It had just entered a new phase. One where the stakes were higher. Where mistakes would be costlier. Where every move required even more careful consideration. But for tonight, Bumpy allowed himself satisfaction. He'd stopped an execution. Destroyed a crime family's captain. Secured Harlem's independence. And done it all without becoming a killer. Without betraying his principles. Without losing himself in the violence that claimed so many others. That was the real victory. Not the territory. Not the money. Not even the respect. But the proof that there was another way. A smarter way. A way that didn't require you to become the monster everyone expected. The months following Bender's death brought unexpected changes to New York's underworld. The Genovese family fractured. Without Bender's leadership, their operations in Upper Manhattan fell into disarray. Captains fought over territory. Soldiers switched allegiances. Money that should have flowed upward disappeared into personal accounts. The commission watched, evaluated, and eventually intervened. They installed new leadership. Younger men, less connected to the old ways. Men who understood that the world was changing. That the rigid hierarchies of the past were becoming liabilities. One of those new leaders was a man named Anthony Salerno. Fat Tony, they called him. He was different from Bender. Pragmatic. Business-focused. Less concerned with tradition and more interested in profit. His first act was reaching out to Bumpy. Not through intermediaries. Directly. They met at a diner in East Harlem. Neutral territory between their worlds. Salerno ordered coffee. Got straight to business. Bender was an idiot, he said. No pretense. No diplomatic language. He let pride and greed destroy him. I'm not making the same mistakes. Bumpy listened. Waiting. I want to propose something, Salerno continued. A real partnership. Not the bullshit arrangement where we pretend to respect boundaries while trying to undercut each other. Actual cooperation. Bumpy raised an eyebrow. What kind of cooperation? Salerno laid out his vision. The Genovese family controlled unions. Docks. Construction. Legitimate businesses that generated steady income. But they struggled with street-level operations. With maintaining relationships in minority neighborhoods. With understanding cultural dynamics they'd never experienced. Bumpy controlled Harlem. Had deep community connections. Understood the streets in ways the Italians never could. Had proven he could operate with sophistication and intelligence. You handle Harlem, Salerno said. All of it. Numbers. Clubs. Whatever rackets you want. We don't interfere. Don't skim. Don't demand tribute. In exchange, you help us with certain situations. Information. Introductions. Access to communities we can't reach. It was revolutionary. A genuine power-sharing arrangement. Not based on subordination, but mutual benefit. Bumpy considered it carefully. The advantages were obvious. Protection from the most powerful crime family in New York. Access to their resources and connections. Legitimacy in the eyes of the underworld. But there were risks. Partnership meant obligation. Meant getting pulled into conflicts that weren't his. Meant losing some autonomy. I need guarantees, Bumpy said. Written agreements. Clear boundaries. And the understanding that if your people violate our arrangement, the consequences are immediate. Salerno nodded. Done. I'll have my lawyer draw up papers. Not legal, obviously, but binding in our world. They shook hands. A new era began. The arrangement worked better than anyone expected. Bumpy provided intelligence on black neighborhoods across New York. Helped the Genovese family navigate cultural situations they'd have bungled on their own. Facilitated introductions to community leaders who could be useful. In return, the Italians kept their word. No incursions into Harlem. No protection rackets. No disrespect. When other families tested the boundaries, the Genovese family backed Bumpy, sent clear messages that Harlem was off limits. The partnership changed perceptions throughout the underworld. Other crime families started viewing black gangsters differently, not as subordinates, as potential partners. The Lucchese family began similar arrangements in Brooklyn. The Colombos did the same in Queens. The racial barriers that had defined organized crime for decades started crumbling, not from social progress, from pragmatism, from the recognition that diversity in criminal enterprises was just good business. Bumpy became a bridge between worlds that had never truly connected, between the Italian mob and black organized crime, between old traditions and new realities. Young black gangsters sought his advice, asked how he'd achieved what seemed impossible, how he'd earned respect from men who'd spent their lives believing in white supremacy. Bumpy's answer was always the same. Be smarter. Be more strategic. Be so valuable they can't afford to dismiss you. And never, ever let them see you as just muscle. You're a businessman, an operator, an equal. Act like it. Demand it. Prove it. That philosophy spread, influenced a generation, changed the trajectory of organized crime in America. Meanwhile, the story of Paolo's execution became legend, told and retold in social clubs, in prisons, wherever criminals gathered. The details changed with each telling. Some versions had Bumpy shooting his way into the warehouse. Others claimed he'd blackmailed the entire commission. But the core remained true. Bumpy Johnson had stopped a Mafia execution, had saved a man's life, had destroyed a crime family in retaliation, and had emerged more powerful than before. The FBI continued watching, building files, looking for opportunities. But Bumpy had learned to operate in spaces they couldn't touch. His partnership with Salerno was unofficial, undocumented, based on handshakes and mutual interest rather than anything that could be proven in court. His criminal enterprises were buffered by layers of insulation. Frontmen, shell companies, careful accounting that left no obvious trails. He'd become untouchable, not through violence, through intelligence, through understanding systems better than those who'd created them, through being 3 moves ahead of everyone else, and through never forgetting the lesson he'd learned that night in the warehouse. Information was power, leverage was control, and the willingness to use both, ruthlessly and strategically, made you more dangerous than any weapon. By 1955, 3 years after the Bender incident, Bumpy Johnson had become a legend in his own time. Not just in Harlem. Across the entire country. Stories about him reached Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles. Everywhere black communities existed alongside organized crime. His name carried weight, respect, sometimes fear, but always recognition that he'd accomplished something unprecedented. He'd forced the Italian Mafia to acknowledge a black gangster as an equal. The younger generation idolized him, wanted to replicate his success, wanted to learn his methods. But Bumpy was selective about who he mentored. He looked for intelligence, patience, the ability to think strategically rather than react emotionally. Men like Nicky Barnes showed promise. Sharp, ambitious, willing to learn. Bumpy brought him into the operation slowly, taught him about leverage, about information, about the importance of appearing legitimate while operating in shadows. Frank Lucas was different, more ruthless, less patient. He wanted power immediately, wanted the respect Bumpy had earned without putting in the decades of work. Bumpy warned him, told him that shortcuts led to prison or graves, that the game required discipline. But Lucas didn't always listen. It would cost him eventually, but that was years away. For now, Bumpy's empire was stable, profitable, protected by arrangements with the Italian families, by informants throughout law enforcement, by a reputation that made most people think twice before challenging him. The rhythm room had been rebuilt after a small fire. Nothing like the Klan attack, just kitchen negligence. But the rebuild made it better, more elegant, a true jewel of Harlem. Duke Ellington still played there. So did Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday. Every major jazz artist knew the rhythm room, knew Bumpy, knew that performing there meant something beyond just a paycheck. It meant being part of Harlem's cultural resistance, part of the statement that black excellence couldn't be suppressed, that beauty and art thrived even in neighborhoods the rest of America tried to forget. Bumpy attended performances regularly, sat in his corner booth, watched the crowd. He was older now, moving slower. The streets had taken their toll. Prison time, violence, stress. But his mind remained sharp. His network remained strong. His influence remained undeniable. The partnership with Fat Tony Salerno continued to evolve. What started as mutual convenience became genuine respect. They met monthly, discussed business, shared information, avoided conflicts before they started. It wasn't friendship. Criminals at that level didn't have friends. But it was something close. An understanding between men who operated in the same darkness, who made similar calculations, who valued intelligence over emotion. Other crime families took notice. The Lucchese organization proposed similar arrangements. Bumpy agreed. With conditions. With boundaries. With the clear understanding that Harlem remained his domain. The Chicago outfit reached out. They'd heard about Bumpy's methods. Wanted advice on managing black neighborhoods in their city. Bumpy provided it. For a fee. For connections. For influence that extended beyond New York. He was building something larger than a local empire. He was building a network. A model. A demonstration that black organized crime could operate at the highest levels. Could compete with established powers. Could thrive through intelligence rather than just violence. But success brought scrutiny. The FBI's interest intensified. Agent Garrett was replaced by younger agents. More aggressive. More willing to bend rules. They wiretapped Bumpy's phones. Followed his associates. Pressured his informants. They never got enough for prosecution. Bumpy was too careful. Too insulated. Too aware of how law enforcement operated. But they made life harder. Made every move require additional planning. Additional caution. In 1956, Bumpy was called to testify before a Senate committee investigating organized crime. The Kefauver hearings had exposed mob operations nationwide. Now Congress wanted to understand the changing dynamics. Wanted to know about black organized crime. Bumpy sat before the committee in an expensive suit. Calm. Composed. He invoked the Fifth Amendment to every substantive question. Gave nothing away. Revealed nothing. The senators were frustrated. They'd expected intimidation to work. Expected threats of contempt charges to break him. But Bumpy had faced worse than politicians. Had survived actual death sentences. Congressional posturing meant nothing. When asked directly about stopping Paolo's execution, Bumpy smiled. I don't know what you're referring to. I'm a businessman. I run nightclubs. I invest in real estate. I have no involvement with organized crime. It was theater. Everyone in the room knew the truth. But knowing and proving were different things. The hearings ended without charging Bumpy. Without getting any useful testimony. The experience reinforced what he already knew. The system couldn't touch him unless he made mistakes. And he didn't make mistakes. Back in Harlem, life continued. The numbers racket produced steady income. The clubs thrived. The community benefited from Bumpy's protection. From his quiet philanthropy. From his willingness to help people who had nowhere else to turn. He paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them. Funded college educations for promising students. Kept predatory lenders away from desperate borrowers. It wasn't altruism. It was investment. In loyalty. In community support. In the network that protected him as much as he protected it. The story of how he destroyed the Bender family continued to spread. New details emerged. Some true. Some exaggerated. But all reinforcing the same message. Bumpy Johnson was someone you didn't cross. Someone who thought 3 moves ahead. Someone who won without needing to fire shots. The final chapter of the Bender story came in an unexpected way. In 1962, 10 years after the warehouse incident, Paolo Mariti's daughter graduated from college. First in her family to earn a degree. She became a teacher. Started working in a Philadelphia public school. Built a life her father could never have imagined. Paolo sent Bumpy a letter. Brief. Respectful. It simply said, "Because of you, my daughter has a future. Because of you, my family survived. I can never repay that debt. But I want you to know it's remembered. Every day. With gratitude that goes beyond words." Bumpy read the letter twice. Then burned it. No evidence. No connections. But the message stayed with him. Because that's what all of this had really been about. Not power. Not money. Not even respect. About protecting life. About creating space for people to survive. To build futures. To escape the cycles that trapped so many others. The Mafia never fully recovered from Bender's fall. The Genovese family remained powerful. But the absolute certainty of Italian supremacy in organized crime had been shattered. Black gangsters, Latino criminals, Asian syndicates. They all saw what Bumpy had demonstrated, that the old hierarchies were negotiable, that intelligence and strategy could overcome traditional barriers. That respect was earned, not inherited. By the mid-1960s, the landscape had changed completely. The civil rights movement was transforming America. Young activists were challenging segregation, demanding equality, fighting for justice in ways Bumpy never had. He watched from the sidelines, never publicly involved, never claiming to be part of the movement, because he understood his role was different. He operated in darkness, used methods that couldn't be celebrated, made compromises that activists would condemn. But in his own way, he'd fought the same battle, had demanded respect from systems designed to deny it, had proven that black men could succeed at the highest levels of any enterprise, legal or illegal. Malcolm X understood this. They'd met a few times, talked about power, about strategy, about what it meant to fight for dignity in a country built on oppression. Malcolm never endorsed Bumpy's methods, but he acknowledged the results, acknowledged that sometimes survival required operating outside the rules that others created to keep you down. When Malcolm was assassinated in 1965, Bumpy attended the funeral, stood in the back, said nothing, but he understood. They'd both been warriors in their own way. Both refused to accept subordination. Both paid prices for their resistance. Bumpy's health began declining in the late 1960s. Heart problems, the stress of decades in the underworld catching up. He started stepping back, delegating more, preparing his succession. He wanted his empire to survive him, to continue protecting Harlem, to maintain the standards he'd established. The partnerships with Italian families remained strong, built on mutual respect that had started with destroying Tony Bender, built on the understanding that cooperation benefited everyone. The younger generation he'd mentored took over operations, some successfully, others less so. Frank Lucas would eventually overstep, would try to build an empire larger than his intelligence could sustain, would end up in prison. Nicky Barnes would become one of the most powerful drug dealers in New York, would appear on magazine covers, would eventually become a government informant. Both would cite Bumpy as inspiration. Both would fail to fully understand his lessons. Because what made Bumpy successful wasn't just strategy. It was restraint, the ability to know when to push and when to hold back, when to fight and when to negotiate, when to use leverage and when to keep it hidden. Those lessons were harder to teach than tactical knowledge, required maturity that couldn't be rushed, required experiences that couldn't be replicated. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack on a Harlem street. He was 62. Hundreds attended his funeral. Musicians, businessmen, politicians who publicly claimed to oppose everything he represented but privately acknowledged his importance. And criminals, from every organization, every family, paying respects to a man who'd changed the game, who'd proven that intelligence mattered more than violence, that a black gangster could achieve what previous generations thought impossible. The story of how he stopped Paolo's execution was told at the funeral, by old men who'd been there, by younger ones who'd heard it secondhand, by people who understood it represented something larger than one saved life. It represented the moment when Bumpy Johnson demonstrated absolute mastery, when he showed that destroying an enemy didn't require bullets, required patience, information, strategic thinking, and the willingness to play a longer game than anyone else. That story became part of Harlem's oral history, passed down through generations, sometimes accurate, often embellished, but always carrying the same essential truth, that Bumpy Johnson had walked into a Mafia execution and stopped it, had destroyed a crime family in retaliation, had forced the Italian mob to acknowledge him as an equal, and had done it all without becoming the monster everyone expected. That was his legacy, not the money, not the empire, not even the power, but the proof that there was another way, a smarter way, a way that required you to be better, sharper, more strategic than anyone who opposed you. The proof that respect, real respect, came from demonstrating undeniable capability, from being so valuable, so intelligent, so essential that even your enemies had to acknowledge your worth. Decades later, people still talk about Bumpy Johnson, about the night he stopped an execution, about how he destroyed Tony Bender, about what it meant for a black man to achieve what he achieved in a world designed to prevent exactly that. The warehouse is gone now, demolished decades ago. The restaurant where the families met is under new ownership. Most of the players are dead, but the story survives. Because it matters. Because it shows that the systems we think are unchangeable can be challenged. That hierarchies we accept as natural are actually negotiable. That one person, with enough intelligence and courage, can reshape reality. That was Bumpy Johnson's final victory. Not the one he won against Tony Bender. The one he won against history itself.